The Witness for the Prosecution. Mr. Mahon adjusted his pince-nez and cleared his throat with a little dry-as-dust cough that was wholly typical of him. Then he looked again at the man opposite him, the man charged with wilful murder. Mr. Mahon was a small man, precise in manner, neatly, not to say foppishly dressed, with a pair of very shrewd and piercing grey eyes, by no means a fool. Indeed, as a solicitor, Mr. Mahon's reputation stood very high. His voice, when he spoke to his client, was dry, but not unsympathetic. I must impress upon you again that you are in very grave danger, and that the utmost frankness is necessary. Leonard Vole, who had been staring in a dazed fashion at the blank wall in front of him, transferred his glance to the solicitor. "I know," he said hopelessly. "You keep telling me so, but I can't seem to realize yet that I'm charged with murder. Murder! And such a dastardly crime, too." Mr. Mahon was practical, not emotional. He coughed again, took off his pince-nez, polished them carefully, and replaced them on his nose. Then he said, Yes. Now, my dear Mr. Vole, we are going to make a determined effort to get you off, and we shall succeed. We shall succeed. But I must have all the facts. I must know just how damaging the case against you is likely to be. Then we can fix upon the best line of defense." Still the young man looked at him in the same dazed, hopeless fashion. To Mr. Mahon the case had seemed black enough, and the guilt of the prisoner assured. Now, for the first time, he felt a doubt. "You think I'm guilty?" said Leonard Vole in a low voice. "But by God, I swear I'm not. It looks pretty black against me, I know that. I'm like a man caught in a net, the meshes of it all round me, entangling me whichever way I turn. But I didn't do it, Mr. Mahon, I didn't do it." In such a position, a man was bound to protest his innocence. Mr. Mahon knew that. Yet, in spite of himself, he was impressed. It might be, after all, that Leonard Vole was innocent. "You are right, Mr. Vole," he said gravely. "The case does look very black against you. Nevertheless, I accept your assurance. Now, let us get to facts. I want you to tell me in your own words exactly how you came to make the acquaintance of Miss Emily French." "It was one day in Oxford Street. I saw an elderly lady crossing the road. She was carrying a lot of parcels. In the middle of the street she dropped them, tried to recover them, found the bus was almost on top of her, and just managed to reach the curb safely, dazed and bewildered by people having shouted at her. I recovered the parcels, wiped the mud off them as best I could, retied the string of one, and returned them to her." "There was no question of your having saved her life?" "Oh, dear me, no. All I did was to perform a common act of courtesy. She was extremely grateful, thanked me warmly, and said something about my manners not being those of most of the younger generation. I can't remember the exact words. Then I lifted my hat and went on. I never expected to see her again. But life is full of coincidences. That very evening I came across her at a party at a friend's house. She recognized me at once and asked that I should be introduced to her. I then found out that she was a Miss Emily French, and that she lived at Cricklewood. I talked to her for some time. She was, I imagine, an old lady who took sudden violent fancies to people. She took one to me on the strength of a perfectly simple action which anyone might have performed. On leaving, she shook me warmly by the hand and asked me to come and see her. I replied, of course, that I would be very pleased to do so, and she then urged me to name a day. I didn't want particularly to go, but it would have seemed churlish to refuse, so I fixed on the following Saturday. After she'd gone, I learned something about her from my friends, that she was rich, eccentric, lived alone with one maid, and owned no less than 8 cats. I see, said Mr. Mahon. The question of her being well off came up as early as that? If you mean that I inquired, began Leonard Vole hotly, but Mr. Mahon stilled him with a gesture. I have to look at the case as it will be presented by the other side. An ordinary observer would not have supposed Miss French to be a lady of means. She lived poorly, almost humbly. Unless you had been told the contrary, you would in all probability have considered her to be in poor circumstances, at any rate to begin with. Who was it, exactly, who told you that she was well off? My friend George Harvey, at whose house the party took place. Is he likely to remember having done so? I really don't know. Of course, it is some time ago now. Quite so, Mr. Vole. You see, the first aim of the prosecution will be to establish that you were in low water financially. That is true, is it not? Leonard Vole flushed. Yes, he said in a low voice. I'd been having a run of infernal bad luck just then. Quite so, said Mr. Mayherne again. That being, as I say, in low water financially, you met this rich old lady and cultivated her acquaintance assiduously. Now, if we are in a position to say that you had no idea she was well off, and that you visited her out of pure kindness of heart, which is the case, I dare say I am not disputing the point. I am looking at it from the outside point of view. A great deal depends on the memory of Mr. Harvey. Is he likely to remember that conversation, or is he not? Could he be confused by counsel into believing that it took place later? Leonard Vole reflected for some minutes. Then he said steadily enough, but with a rather paler face, I don't think that line would be successful, Mr. Mayherne. Several of those present heard his remark, and one or two of them chaffed me about my conquest of a rich old lady. The solicitor endeavoured to hide his disappointment with a wave of the hand. Unfortunately, he said. But I congratulate you upon your plain speaking, Mr. Vole. It is to you I look to guide me. Your judgment is quite right. To persist in the line I spoke of would have been disastrous. We must leave that point. You made the acquaintance of Miss French. You called upon her. The acquaintanceship progressed. We want a clear reason for all this. Why did you, a young man of 33, good-looking, fond of sport, popular with your friends, devote so much time to an elderly woman with whom you could hardly have anything in common? Leonard Vole flung out his hands in a nervous gesture. I can't tell you. I really can't tell you. After the first visit, she pressed me to come again, spoke of being lonely and unhappy. She made it difficult for me to refuse. She showed so plainly her fondness and affection for me that I was placed in an awkward position. You see, Mr. Mayherne, I've got a weak nature. I drift. I'm one of those people who can't say no. And believe me or not, as you like, after the third or fourth visit I paid her, I found myself getting genuinely fond of the old thing. My mother died when I was young. An aunt brought me up, and she, too, died before I was 15. If I told you that I genuinely enjoyed being mothered and pampered, I dare say you'd only laugh. Mr. Mayherne did not laugh. Instead, he took off his pince-nez again and polished them. Always a sign with him that he was thinking deeply. I accept your explanation, Mr. Vole, he said at last. I believe it to be psychologically probable. Whether a jury would take that view of it is another matter. Please continue your narrative. When was it that Miss French first asked you to look into her business affairs? After my third or fourth visit to her. She understood very little of money matters and was worried about some investments. Mr. Mayherne looked up sharply. Be careful, Mr. Vole. The maid, Janet Mackenzie, declares that her mistress was a good woman of business and transacted all her own affairs, and this is borne out by the testimony of her bankers. I can't help that, said Vole earnestly. That's what she said to me. Mr. Mayherne looked at him for a moment or two in silence. Though he had no intention of saying so, his belief in Leonard Vole's innocence was, at that moment, strengthened. He knew something of the mentality of elderly ladies. He saw Miss French, infatuated with the good-looking young man, hunting about for pretexts that should bring him to the house. What more likely than that she should plead ignorance of business and beg him to help her with her money affairs? She was enough of a woman of the world to realize that any man is slightly flattered by such an admission of his superiority. Leonard Vole had been flattered. Perhaps, too, she had not been averse to letting this young man know that she was wealthy. Emily French had been a strong-willed old woman, willing to pay her price for what she wanted. All this passed rapidly through Mr. Mayherne's mind, but he gave no indication of it, and asked instead a further question. And you did handle her affairs for her at her request? I did. "Mr. Vole," said the solicitor, "I'm going to ask you a very serious question, and one to which it is vital I should have a truthful answer. You were in low water financially. You had the handling of an old lady's affairs, an old lady who, according to her own statement, knew little or nothing of business. Did you at any time, or in any manner, convert to your own use the securities which you handled? Did you engage in any transaction for your own pecuniary advantage which will not bear the light of day?" He quelled the other's response. "Wait a minute before you answer. There are two courses open to us. Either we can make a feature of your probity and honesty in conducting her affairs, whilst pointing out how unlikely it is that you would commit murder to obtain money which you might have obtained by such infinitely easier means. If, on the other hand, there is anything in your dealings which the prosecution will get hold of, if, to put it boldly, it can be proved that you swindled the old lady in any way, we must take the line that you had no motive for the murder, since she was already a profitable source of income to you. You perceive the distinction. Now, I beg of you, take your time before you reply." But Leonard Vole took no time at all. "My dealings with Miss French's affairs are all perfectly fair and above board. I acted for her interests to the very best of my ability, as anyone will find who looks into the matter." "Thank you," said Mr. Mayhern. "You relieve my mind very much. I pay you the compliment of believing that you are far too clever to lie to me over such an important matter." "Surely," said Vole eagerly, "the strongest point in my favor is the lack of motive. Granted that I cultivated the acquaintanceship of a rich old lady in the hope of getting money out of her, that, I gather, is the substance of what you have been saying. Surely her death frustrates all my hopes." The solicitor looked at him steadily, then very deliberately he repeated his unconscious trick with his pince-nez. It was not until they were firmly replaced on his nose that he spoke. "Are you not aware, Mr. Vole? Miss French left a will under which you are the principal beneficiary." "What?" The prisoner sprang to his feet. His dismay was obvious and unforced. "My God, what are you saying? She left her money to me?" Mr. Mayhern nodded slowly. Vole sank down again, his head in his hands. "You pretend you know nothing of this will?" "Pretend? There's no pretense about it. I knew nothing about it." "What would you say if I told you that the maid, Janet Mackenzie, swears that you did know? That her mistress told her distinctly that she had consulted you in the matter and told you of her intentions?" "Say that she's lying? No, I go too fast. Janet is an elderly woman. She was a faithful watchdog to her mistress, and she didn't like me. She was jealous and suspicious. I should say that Miss French confided her intentions to Janet, and that Janet either mistook something she said, or else was convinced in her own mind that I persuaded the old lady into doing it. I dare say that she believes herself now that Miss French actually told her so." "You don't think that she dislikes you enough to lie deliberately about the matter?" Leonard Vole looked shocked and startled. "Oh, indeed, why should she?" "I don't know," said Mr. Mayhern thoughtfully, "but she's very bitter against you." The wretched young man groaned again. "Oh, I'm beginning to see," he muttered. "It's frightful. I made up to her, that's what they'll all say. I got her to make a will leaving her money to me, and then I go there that night and there's nobody in the house. They find her the next day. Oh, my God, it's awful." "You are wrong about there being nobody in the house," said Mr. Mayhern. "Janet, as you remember, was to go out for the evening. She went, but about 9:30 she returned to fetch the pattern of a blouse sleeve which she had promised to a friend. She let herself in by the back door, went upstairs and fetched it, and went out again. She heard voices in the sitting-room, though she could not distinguish what they said, but she will swear that one of them was Miss French's, and one was a man's."
"At 9:30, said Leonard Vole. "At 9:30?
He sprang to his feet.
"But then I'm saved! Saved!"
"What do you mean, saved?" cried Mr. Mayherne, astonished.
"By 9:30 I was at home again. My wife can prove that. I left Miss French about 5 minutes to 9. I arrived home about 9:20. My wife was there waiting for me. Oh, thank God, and bless Janet Mackenzie's sleeve pattern."
In his exuberance he hardly noticed that the grave expression of the solicitor's face had not altered, but the latter's words brought him down to earth with a bump. "Who, then, in your opinion, murdered Miss French?"
"Why, a burglar, of course, as was thought at first. The window was forced, you remember? She was killed with a heavy blow from a crowbar, and the crowbar was found lying on the floor beside the body, and several articles were missing. But for Janet's absurd suspicions and dislike of me, the police would never have swerved from the right track."
"That will hardly do, Mr. Vole," said the solicitor. "The things that were missing were mere trifles of no value taken as a blind, and the marks on the window were not all conclusive. Besides, think for yourself. You say that you were no longer in the house by 9:30. Who, then, was the man Janet heard talking to Miss French in the sitting-room? She would hardly be having an amicable conversation with a burglar."
"No," said Vole. "No."
He looked puzzled and discouraged.
"But anyway," he added with reviving spirit, "it lets me out. I've got an alibi. You must see Romaine, my wife, at once."
"Certainly," acquiesced the lawyer. "I should already have seen Mrs. Vole but for her being absent when you were arrested. I wired to Scotland at once, and I understand that she arrives back tonight. I am going to call upon her immediately I leave here." Vole nodded, a great expression of satisfaction settling down over his face.
"Yes, Romaine will tell you. Ah, God, it's a lucky chance, that."
"Excuse me, Mr. Vole, but you are very fond of your wife?"
"Of course."
"And she of you?"
"Romaine is devoted to me. She'd do anything in the world for me."
He spoke enthusiastically, but the solicitor's heart sank a little lower. The testimony of a devoted wife, would it gain credence? "Was there anyone else who saw you return at 9:20? A maid, for instance?"
"We have no maid."
"Did you meet anyone in the street on the way back?"
"Nobody I knew. I rode part of the way in a bus. The conductor might remember."
Mr. Mayherne shook his head doubtfully. "There is no one, then, who can confirm your wife's testimony?"
"No, but it isn't necessary, surely."
I dare say not, said Mr. Mayherne hastily. "Now there is just one thing more. Did Miss French know that you were a married man?"
"Oh, yes."
"Yet you never took your wife to see her. Why was that?" For the first time, Leonard Vole's answer came halting and uncertain.
"Well, I don't know."
"Are you aware that Janet Mackenzie says her mistress believed you to be single and contemplated marrying you in the future?" Vole laughed.
"Absurd! There was 40 years' difference in age between us."
"It has been done," said the solicitor dryly. "The fact remains, your wife never met Miss French."
"No."
Again the constraint. "You will permit me to say," said the lawyer, "that I hardly understand your attitude in the matter." Vole flushed, hesitated, and then spoke.
"I'll make a clean breast of it. I was hard up, as you know. I hoped that Miss French might lend me some money. She was fond of me, but she wasn't at all interested in the struggles of a young couple. Early on, I found that she had taken it for granted that my wife and I didn't get on, were living apart. Mr. Mayherne, I wanted the money for Romaine's sake. I said nothing and allowed the old lady to think what she chose. She spoke of my being an adopted son for her. There was never any question of marriage. That must be just Janet's imagination.
And that is all?
Yes, that is all.
Was there just a shade of hesitation in the words? The lawyer fancied so. He rose and held out his hand.
Goodbye, Mr. Vole.
He looked into the haggard young face and spoke with an unusual impulse.
I believe in your innocence, in spite of the multitude of facts arrayed against you. I hope to prove it and vindicate you completely.
Bowles smiled back at him.
You find the alibis all right, he said cheerfully.
Again, he hardly noticed that the other did not respond.
The whole thing hinges a good deal on the testimony of Janet Mackenzie, said Mr. Mahon. She hates you. That much is clear.
She can hardly hate me, protested the young man. The solicitor shook his head as he went out.
Now for Mrs. Vole, he said to himself.
He was seriously disturbed by the way the thing was shaping. The Voles lived in a small, shabby house near Paddington Green. It was to this house that Mr. Mahon went. In answer to his ring, a big, slatternly woman, obviously a charwoman, answered the door.
Mrs. Vole, has she returned yet?
Got back an hour ago, but I don't know if you can see her.
If you'll take my card to her, said Mr. Mahon quietly, I'm quite sure that she will do so.
The woman looked at him doubtfully, wiped her hand on her apron and took the card. Then she closed the door in his face and left him on the step outside. In a few minutes, however, she returned with a slightly altered manner. "Come inside, please." She ushered him into a tiny drawing-room. Mr. Mahon, examining a drawing on the wall, stared up suddenly to face a tall, pale woman who had entered so quietly that he had not heard her. "Mr. Mahon, you are my husband's solicitor, are you not? You have come from him? Will you please sit down?" Until she spoke, he had not realized that she was not English. Now, observing her more closely, he noticed the high cheekbones, the dense blue-black of the hair, and an occasional very slight movement of the hands that was distinctly foreign, a strange woman, very quiet, so quiet as to make one uneasy. From the very first, Mr. Mahon was conscious that he was up against something that he did not understand.
"Now, my dear Mrs. Vole," he began, "you must not give way."
He stopped. It was so very obvious that Romaine Vole had not the slightest intention of giving way. She was perfectly calm and composed. "Will you please tell me all about it?" she said. "I must know everything. Do not think to spare me. I want to know the worst." She hesitated, then repeated in a lower tone with a curious emphasis which the lawyer did not understand. "I want to know the worst." Mr. Mahon went over his interview with Leonard Vole. She listened attentively, nodding her head now and then. "I see," she said when he had finished. "He wants me to say that he came in at 20 minutes past 9 that night."
"He did come in at that time?"
said Mr. Mahon sharply.
"That is not the point," she said coldly. "Will my saying so acquit him? Will they believe me?"
Mr. Mahon was taken aback. She had gone so quickly to the core of the matter.
"That is what I want to know," she said. "Will it be enough? Is there anyone else who can support my evidence?"
There was a suppressed eagerness in her manner that made him vaguely uneasy.
"So far there is no one else," he said reluctantly.
"I see," said Romaine Vole. She sat for a minute or two perfectly still. A little smile played over her lips. The lawyer's feeling of alarm grew stronger and stronger.
"Mrs. Vole," he began, "I know what you must feel."
"Do you?" she said.
"I wonder.
In the circumstances,
I intend to play a lone hand."
He looked at her in dismay. "But, my dear Mrs. Vole, you are overwrought. Being so devoted to your husband."
"I beg your pardon?"
The sharpness of her voice made him start. He repeated in a hesitating manner, "Being so devoted to your husband." Romaine Vole nodded slowly, the same strange smile on her lips.
"Did he tell you that I was devoted to him?"
she asked softly.
"Ah, yes, I can see he did. How stupid men are. Stupid, stupid, stupid."
She rose suddenly to her feet. All the intense emotion that the lawyer had been conscious of in the atmosphere was now concentrated in her tone.
"I hate him, I tell you. I hate him, I hate him, I hate him. I would like to see him hanged by the neck till he is dead."
The lawyer recoiled before her and the smouldering passion in her eyes. She advanced a step nearer and continued vehemently,
"Perhaps I shall see it. Supposing I tell you that he did not come in that night at 9:20, but at 10:20. You say that he tells you he knew nothing about the money coming to him. Supposing I tell you he knew all about it, and counted on it, and committed murder to get it. Supposing I tell you that he admitted to me that night when he came in what he had done, that there was blood on his coat. What then? Supposing that I stand up in court and say all these things."
Her eyes seemed to challenge him. With an effort, he concealed his growing dismay and endeavored to speak in a rational tone. "You cannot be asked to give evidence against your own husband."
"He is not my husband."
The words came out so quickly that he fancied he'd misunderstood her. "I beg your pardon,
He is not my husband."
The silence was so intense that you could have heard a pin drop.
"I was an actress in Vienna. My husband is alive, but in a madhouse, so we could not marry. I'm glad now."
She nodded defiantly. "I should like you to tell me one thing," said Mr. Mayherne. He contrived to appear as cool and unemotional as ever. "Why are you so bitter against Leonard Vole?" She shook her head, smiling a little.
"Yes, you would like to know, but I shall not tell you. I will keep my secret."
Mr. Mayherne gave his dry little cough and rose. "There seems no point in prolonging this interview," he remarked. "You will hear from me again after I have communicated with my client." She came closer to him, looking into his eyes with her own wonderful dark ones.
"Tell me," she said, "did you believe, honestly, that he was innocent when you came here today?"
"I did," said Mr. Mayherne.
"You poor little man," she laughed.
"And I believe so still," finished the lawyer. "Good evening, madam." He went out of the room, taking with him the memory of her startled face. "This is going to be the devil of a business," said Mr. Mayherne to himself as he strode along the street. "Extraordinary, the whole thing. An extraordinary woman, a very dangerous woman. Women were the devil when they got their knife into you. What was to be done? That wretched young man hadn't a leg to stand upon, of course. Possibly he did commit the crime. "No," said Mr. Mayherne to himself. "No, there's almost too much evidence against him. I don't believe this woman. She was trumping up the whole story. She'll never bring it into court." He wished he felt more conviction on the point. The police court proceedings were brief and dramatic. The principal witnesses for the prosecution were Janet Mackenzie, maid to the dead woman, and Romaine Heilger, Austrian subject, the mistress of the prisoner. Mr. Mayherne sat in the court and listened to the damning story that the latter told. It was on the lines she had indicated to him in their interview. The prisoner reserved his defense and was committed for trial. Mr. Mayherne was at his wits' end. The case against Leonard Vole was black beyond words. Even the famous K.C. who was engaged for the defence held out little hope. "If we can shake that Austrian woman's testimony, we might do something," he said dubiously. "But it's a bad business." Mr. Mayherne had concentrated his energies on one single point. Assuming Leonard Vole to be speaking the truth, and to have left the murdered woman's house at 9 o'clock, who was the man whom Janet heard talking to Miss French at 9:30? The only ray of light was in the shape of a scapegrace nephew who had in bygone days cajoled and threatened his aunt out of various sums of money. Janet Mackenzie, the solicitor learned, had always been attached to this young man, and had never ceased urging his claims upon her mistress. It certainly seemed possible that it was this nephew who had been with Miss French after Leonard Vole left, especially as he was not to be found in any of his old haunts. In all other directions, the lawyer's researches had been negative in their result. No one had seen Leonard Vole entering his own house, or leaving that of Miss French. No one had seen any other man enter or leave the house in Cricklewood. All inquiries drew blank. It was the eve of the trial when Mr. Mayherne received the letter, which was to lead his thoughts in an entirely new direction. It came by the 6 o'clock post, an illiterate scrawl, written on common paper and enclosed in a dirty envelope with the stamp stuck on crooked. Mr. Mayherne read it through once or twice before he grasped its meaning. "Dear Mister, you're the lawyer chap what acts for young fella. If you want that painted fine hussy showed up for what she is, and a bag of lies, you come to 16 Shaw's Rents, Stepney, tonight. It'll cost you 200 quid. Ask for Mrs. Mogson." The solicitor read and reread this strange epistle. It might, of course, be a hoax, but when he thought it over, he became increasingly convinced that it was genuine, and also convinced that it was the one hope for the prisoner. The evidence of Romain Heilger damned him completely, and the line the defence meant to pursue, the line that the evidence of a woman who had admittedly lived an immoral life was not to be trusted, was at best a weak one. Mr. Mayherne's mind was made up. It was his duty to save his client at all costs. He must go to Shaw's Rents. He had some difficulty in finding the place, a ramshackle building in an evil-smelling slum, but at last he did so, and on inquiry for Mrs. Mogson was sent up to a room on the 3rd floor. On this door he knocked, and getting no answer, knocked again. At this second knock he heard a shuffling sound inside, and presently the door was opened cautiously half an inch, and a bent figure peered out. Suddenly the woman, for it was a woman, gave a chuckle and opened the door wider. "So it's you, dearie," she said in a wheezy voice. "Nobody with you, is there? No playing tricks? That's right. You can come in. You can come in." With some reluctance, the lawyer stepped across the threshold into the small, dirty room with its flickering gas jet. There was an untidy, unmade bed in a corner, a plain deal table, and 2 rickety chairs. For the first time, Mr. Mayherne had a full view of the tenant of this unsavoury apartment. She was a woman of middle age, bent in figure, with a mass of untidy grey hair, and a scarf wound tightly around her face. She saw him looking at this, and laughed again, the same curious, toneless chuckle. "Wondering why I hide my beauty, dear? Afraid it may tempt you, eh? But you shall see. You shall see." She drew aside the scarf, and the lawyer recoiled involuntarily before the almost formless blur of scarlet. She replaced the scarf again. "So you're not wanting to kiss me, dearie? I don't wonder. And yet I was a pretty girl once, not so long ago as you'd think, either. Vitriol, dearie, vitriol, that's what did that.
Oh, but I'll be even with them!" She burst into a hideous torrent of profanity which Mr. Mayherne tried vainly to quell. She fell silent at last, her hands clenching and unclenching themselves nervously. "Enough of that," said the lawyer sternly. "I have come here because I have reason to believe that you can give me information which will clear my client, Leonard Vole. Is that the case?" Her eye leered at him cunningly. "What about the money, dearie?" she wheezed. 200 quid, you remember? "It is your duty to give evidence, and you can be called upon to do so." "That won't do, dearie. I'm no woman, I know nothing, but you give me 200 quid, and perhaps I can give you a hint or two, see?" "What kind of hint?" "What should you say to a letter? A letter from her. Never mind now, I got hold of it. That's my business. It'll do the trick, but I want my 200 quid. Mr. Mayherne looked at her coldly and made up his mind. "I'll give you £10, nothing more. And only that, if this letter is what you say it is." £10? She screamed and raved at him. 20, said Mr. Mayherne, and that's my last word. He rose as if to go. Then, watching her closely, he drew out a pocket-book and counted out 20 £1 notes. "You see," he said, "that is all I have with me. You can take it or leave it." But already he knew that the sight of the money was too much for her. She cursed and raved impotently, but at last she gave in. Going over to the bed, she drew something out from beneath the tattered mattress. "Here you are, damn you!" she snarled. "It's a top one you want."
End of side 1. End of side 1. End of side 1. End of side 1. Side 2.
It was a bundle of letters that she threw to him, and Mr. Mayherne untied them and scanned them in his usual cool, methodical manner. The woman, watching him eagerly, could gain no clue from his impassive face. He read each letter through, and then returned again to the top one and read it a second time. Then he tied the whole bundle up again carefully. They were love letters, written by Romain Heilger, and the man they were written to was not Leonard Vole. The top letter was dated the day of the latter's arrest.
"I spoke true, dearie, didn't I?"
whined the woman.
"It'll do for her, that letter."
Mr. Mayherne put the letters in his pocket, and then he asked a question. "How did you get hold of this correspondence?"
"Oh, that's telling," she said with a leer. "But I know something more. I heard in court what that hussy said. Find out where she was at 10:20, the time she said she was at home. Ask up at the Lion Road Cinema, they remember. A fine upstanding girl like that. Curse her!"
"Who is the man?" asked Mr. Mayherne. "There's only a Christian name here." The other's voice grew thick and hoarse. Her hands clenched and unclenched. Finally, she lifted one to her face.
"He's the man what did this to me. Many years ago now. She took him away from me, a chit of a girl she was then, and when I went after him, I went for him too. He threw the cursed stuff at me, and she laughed, dabber. I've had it in for her for years, followed her, I have spied upon her, and I got her. She'll suffer for this, won't she, Mr. Lawyer? She'll suffer."
"She will probably be sentenced to a term of imprisonment for perjury," said Mr. Mayherne quietly.
"Shut away, that's what I want. You're going, are you? Where's my money? Where's that good money?"
Without a word, Mr. Mayherne put down the notes on the table. Then, drawing a deep breath, he turned and left the squalid room. Looking back, he saw the old woman crooning over the money. He wasted no time. He found the cinema in Lyon Road easily enough, and shown a photograph of Romaine Heilger, the commissionaire recognized her at once. She had arrived at the cinema with a man some time after 10 o'clock on the evening in question. He had not noticed her escort particularly, but he remembered the lady who had spoken to him about the picture that was showing. They stayed until the end, about an hour later. Mr. Mayherne was satisfied. Romaine Heilger's evidence was a tissue of lies from beginning to end. She had evolved it out of her passionate hatred. The lawyer wondered whether he would ever know what lay behind that hatred. What had Leonard Vole done to her? He had seemed dumbfounded when the solicitor had reported her attitude to him. He had declared earnestly that such a thing was incredible. Yet it had seemed to Mr. Mayherne that after the first astonishment his protests had lacked sincerity. He did know. Mr. Mayherne was convinced of it. He knew, but had no intention of revealing the fact. The secret between those two remained a secret. Mr. Mayherne wondered if someday he should come to learn what it was. The solicitor glanced at his watch. It was late, but time was everything. He hailed a taxi and gave an address. Sir Charles must know of this at once, he murmured to himself as he got in. The trial of Leonard Vole for the murder of Emily French aroused widespread interest. In the first place, the prisoner was young and good-looking. Then he was accused of a particularly dastardly crime, and there was the further interest of Romaine Heilger, the principal witness for the prosecution. There had been pictures of her in many papers, and several fictitious stories as to her origin and history. The proceedings opened quietly enough. Various technical evidence came first. Then Janet Mackenzie was called. She told substantially the same story as before. In cross-examination, counsel for the defense succeeded in getting her to contradict herself once or twice over her account of Vole's association with Miss French. He emphasized the fact that though she had heard a man's voice in the sitting room that night, there was nothing to show that it was Vole who was there, and he managed to drive home a feeling that jealousy and dislike of the prisoner were at the bottom of a good deal of her evidence. Then the next witness was called. "Your name is Romaine Heilger?" "Yes." "You are an Austrian subject?" "Yes." "For the last 3 years you have lived with the prisoner and passed yourself off as his wife?" Just for a moment, Romaine Heilger's eye met those of the man in the dock. Her expression held something curious and unfathomable. "Yes." The questions went on. Word by word, the damning facts came out. On the night in question, the prisoner had taken out a crowbar with him. He had returned at 20 minutes past 10 and had confessed to having killed the old lady. His cuffs had been stained with blood, and he had burned them in the kitchen stove. He had terrorized her into silence by means of threats. As the story proceeded, the feeling of the court, which had, to begin with, been slightly favorable to the prisoner, now set dead against him. He himself sat with downcast head and moody air, as though he knew he were doomed. Yet it might have been noted that her own counsel sought to restrain Romaine's animosity. He would have preferred her to be a more unbiased witness. Formidable and ponderous, counsel for the defense arose. He put it to her that her story was a malicious fabrication from start to finish, and that she had not even been in her own house at the time in question, that she was in love with another man and was deliberately seeking to send Vole to his death for a crime he did not commit. Romaine denied these allegations with superb insolence. Then came the surprising denouement, the production of the letter. It was read aloud in court in the midst of a breathless stillness. "Max, beloved, the fates have delivered him into our hands. He has been arrested for murder, but yes, the murder of an old lady.
Leonard, who would not hurt a fly. At last I shall have my revenge. The poor chicken. I shall say that he came in that night with blood upon him, that he confessed to me. I shall hang him, Max. And when he hangs, he will know and realize that it was Romaine who sent him to his death. And then, happiness, beloved. Happiness at last.
There were experts present ready to swear that the handwriting was that of Romaine Heilger, but they were not needed. Confronted with the letter, Romaine broke down utterly and confessed everything. Leonard Vole had returned to the house at the time he said, 9:20. She had invented the whole story to ruin him. With the collapse of Romaine Heilger, the case for the Crown collapsed also. Sir Charles called his few witnesses. The prisoner himself went into the box and told his story in a manly, straightforward manner, unshaken by cross-examination. The prosecution endeavored to rally, but without great success. The judge's summing up was not wholly favorable to the prisoner, but a reaction had set in, and the jury needed little time to consider their verdict. We find the prisoner not guilty. Leonard Vole was free. Little Mr. Mayherne hurried from his seat. He must congratulate his client. He found himself polishing his pince-nez vigorously and checked himself. His wife had told him only the night before that he was getting a habit of it. Curious things, habits. People themselves never knew they had them. An interesting case, a very interesting case. That woman now, Romaine Heilger. The case was dominated for him still by the exotic figure of Romaine Heilger. She had seemed a pale, quiet woman in a house at Paddington, but in court she had flamed out against the sober background. She had flaunted herself like a tropical flower. If he closed his eyes, he could see her now, tall and vehement, her exquisite body bent forward a little, her right hand clenching and unclenching itself unconsciously all the time. Curious things, habits. That gesture of hers with the hand was her habit, he supposed. Yet he'd seen someone else do it quite lately. Who was it now? Quite lately. He drew in his breath with a gasp as it came back to him. The woman in Shaw's Rents. He stood still, his head whirling. It was impossible. Impossible! And yet Romaine Heilger was an actress. The K.C. came up behind him and clapped him on the shoulder. Congratulated our man yet? He's had a narrow shave, you know. Come along and see him. But the little lawyer shook off the other's hand. He wanted one thing only, to see Romaine Heilger face to face. He did not see her until some time later, and the place of their meeting is not relevant. "So you guessed," she said, when he had told her all that was in his mind. "The face, oh, that was easy enough. And the light of that gas jet was too bad for you to see the makeup. But why did I play a lone hand?" She smiled a little, remembering the last time she had used the words. "Such an elaborate comedy. My friend, I had to save him. The evidence of a woman devoted to him would not have been enough. You hinted as much yourself, but I know something of the psychology of crowds. Let my evidence be wrung from me as an admission, damning me in the eyes of the law, and a reaction in favor of the prisoner would immediately set in. And the bundle of letters, one alone, the vital one, might have seemed like a put-up job. Then the man called Max never existed, my friend." "I still think," said little Mr. Mayherne in an aggrieved manner, "that we could have got him off by the normal procedure." "I dared not risk it. You see, you thought he was innocent." "Ah, and you knew it. "I see," said little Mr. Mayhern.
"My dear Mr. Mayhern," said Romaine, "you do not see at all. I knew he was guilty."
The Mystery of the Blue Jar. Jack Hartington surveyed his topped drive ruefully. Standing by the ball, he looked back to the tee, measuring the distance. His face was eloquent of the disgusted contempt which he felt. With a sigh, he drew out his iron, executed 2 vicious swings with it, annihilating in turn a dandelion and a tuft of grass, and then addressed himself firmly to the ball. It's hard when you're 24 years of age, and your one ambition in life is to reduce your handicap at golf, to be forced to give time and attention to the problem of earning your living. 5.5 days out of the 7 saw Jack imprisoned in a kind of mahogany tomb in the city. Saturday afternoon and Sunday were religiously devoted to the real business of life, and in an excess of zeal he had taken rooms at the small hotel near Stourton Heath Links, and rose daily at the hour of 6 a.m. to get in an hour's practice before catching the 8:46 to town. The only disadvantage to the plan was that he seemed constitutionally unable to hit anything at that hour in the morning. A foozled iron succeeded a muffed drive. His mashy shots ran merrily along the ground, and 4 putts seemed to be the minimum on any green. Jack sighed, grasped his iron firmly, and repeated to himself the magic words, "Left arm right through and don't look up." He swung back and then stopped, petrified, as a shrill cry rent the silence of the summer's morning. "Murder!" it called. "Help! Murder!" It was a woman's voice, and it died away at the end into a sort of a gurgling sigh. Jack flung down his club and ran in the direction of the sound. It had come from somewhere quite near at hand. This particular part of the course was quite wild country, and there were few houses about. In fact, there was only one near at hand, a small picturesque cottage, which Jack had often noticed for its air of old-world daintiness. It was towards this cottage that he ran. It was hidden from him by a heather-covered slope, but he rounded this, and in less than a minute was standing with his hand on the small latched gate. There was a girl standing in the garden, and for a moment Jack jumped to the natural conclusion that it was she who had uttered the cry for help, but he quickly changed his mind. She had a little basket in her hand, half full of weeds, and had evidently just straightened herself up from weeding a wide border of pansies. Her eyes, Jack noticed, were just like pansies themselves, velvety and soft and dark and more violet than blue. She was like a pansy altogether in her straight purple linen gown. The girl was looking at Jack with an expression midway between annoyance and surprise. "I beg your pardon," said the young man, "but did you cry out just now?" "I? No, indeed." Her surprise was so genuine that Jack felt confused. Her voice was very soft and pretty, with a slight foreign inflection. "But you must have heard it," he exclaimed. "It came from somewhere just near here." She stared at him. "I heard nothing at all." Jack, in his turn, stared at her. It was perfectly incredible that she should not have heard that agonized appeal for help, and yet her calmness was so evident that he could not believe she was lying to him. "It came from somewhere close at hand," he insisted. She was looking at him suspiciously now. "What did it say?" she asked. "Murder! Help! Murder!" "Murder, help, murder," repeated the girl. "Somebody has played a trick on you, monsieur. Who could be murdered here?" Jack looked about him with a confused idea of discovering a dead body upon a garden path. Yet he was still perfectly sure that the cry he had heard was real and not a product of his imagination. He looked up at the cottage windows. Everything seemed perfectly still and peaceful. "Do you want to search our house?" asked the girl dryly. She was so clearly skeptical that Jack's confusion grew deeper than ever. He turned away. "I'm sorry," he said. "It must have come from higher up in the woods." He raised his cap and retreated. Glancing back over his shoulder, he saw that the girl had calmly resumed her weeding. For some time he hunted through the woods, but could find no sign of anything unusual having occurred. Yet he was as positive as ever that he had really heard the cry. In the end he gave up the search and hurried home to bolt his breakfast and catch the 8:46 by the usual narrow margin of a second or so. His conscience pricked him a little as he sat in the train. Ought he not to have immediately reported what he had heard to the police? That he had not done so was solely owing to the pansy girl's incredulity. She had clearly suspected him of romancing. Possibly the police might do the same. Was he absolutely certain that he had heard the cry? By now he was not nearly so positive as he had been. The natural result of trying to recapture a lost sensation. Was it some bird's cry in the distance that he had twisted into the semblance of a woman's voice? But he rejected the suggestion angrily. It was a woman's voice, and he had heard it. He remembered looking at his watch just before the cry had come. As nearly as possible, it must have been 5:20 past 7 when he had heard the call. That might be a fact useful to the police, if anything should be discovered. Going home that evening, he scanned the evening papers anxiously to see if there were any mention of a crime having been committed, but there was nothing, and he hardly knew whether to be relieved or disappointed. The following morning was wet, so wet that even the most ardent golfer might have his enthusiasm damped. Jack rose at the last possible moment, gulped his breakfast, ran for the train, and again eagerly scanned the papers. Still no mention of any gruesome discovery having been made. The evening papers told the same tale. "Queer," said Jack to himself. But there it is. Probably some blinking little boys having a game together up in the woods." He was out early the following morning, and as he passed the cottage he noted out of the tail of his eye that the girl was out in the garden again, weeding, evidently a habit of hers. He did a particularly good approach shot and hoped that she had noticed it. As he teed up on the next tee, he glanced at his watch. "Just 5:20 past 7, he murmured. "I wonder—" The words were frozen on his lips. From behind him came the same cry which had so startled him before, a woman's voice in dire distress. "Murder! Help! Murder!" Jack raced back. The pansy girl was standing by the gate. She looked startled, and Jack ran up to her triumphantly, crying out, "You heard it this time, anyway!" Her eyes were wide with some emotion he could not fathom, but he noticed that she shrank back from him as he approached, and even glanced back at the house, as though she meditated running to it for shelter. She shook her head, staring at him. "I heard nothing at all," she said wonderingly. It was as though she had struck him a blow between the eyes. Her sincerity was so evident that he could not disbelieve her, yet he couldn't have imagined it. He couldn't. He heard her voice speaking gently, almost with sympathy. "You have had the shell shock, yes?" In a flash he understood her look of fear, her glance back at the house. She thought that he suffered from delusions. Then, like a douche of cold water, came the horrible thought. Was she right? Did he suffer from delusions? Obsessed by the horror of the thought, he turned and stumbled away without vouchsafing a word. The girl watched him go, sighed, shook her head, and bent down to her weeding again. Jack endeavoured to reason matters out with himself. "If I hear the damned thing again at 25 past 7, he said to himself, "it's clear that I've got hold of a hallucination of some sort. But I won't hear it." He was nervous all that day, and went to bed early, determined to put the matter to the proof the following morning. As was perhaps natural in such a case, he remained awake half the night and finally overslept himself. It was 20 past 7 by the time he was clear of the hotel and running towards the links. He realized that he would not be able to get to the fatal spot by 25 past, but surely if the voice was a hallucination pure and simple, he would hear it anywhere. He ran on, his eyes fixed on the hands of his watch. 25 past. From far off came the echo of a woman's voice, calling. The words could not be distinguished, but he was convinced that it was the same cry he had heard before, and that it came from the same spot, somewhere in the neighborhood of the cottage. Strangely enough, that fact reassured him it might, after all, be a hoax. Unlikely as it seemed, the girl herself might be playing a trick on him. He set his shoulders resolutely and took out a club from his golf bag. He would play the few holes up to the cottage. The girl was in the garden, as usual. She looked up this morning, and when he raised his cap to her, said good morning, rather shyly. She looked, he thought, lovelier than ever. "Nice day, isn't it?" Jack called out cheerily, cursing the unavoidable banality of the observation.
"Yes, indeed, it is lovely."
"Good for the garden, I expect." The girl smiled a little, disclosing a fascinating dimple.
"Ah, alas, no. For my flowers the rain is needed. See, they are all dried up."
Jack accepted the invitation of her gesture and came up to the low hedge dividing the garden from the course, looking over it into the garden. "They seem all right," he remarked awkwardly, conscious as he spoke of the girl's slightly pitying glance running over him.
"The sun is good, is it not?" she said. "For the flowers one can always water them, but the sun gives strength and repairs the health. Monsieur is much better today, I can see."
Her encouraging tone annoyed Jack intensely. "Curse it all," he said to himself. "I believe she's trying to cure me by suggestion." "I'm perfectly well," he said.
"That is good, then,"
returned the girl quickly and soothingly. Jack had the irritating feeling that she didn't believe him. He played a few more holes and hurried back to breakfast. As he ate it, he was conscious, not for the first time, of the close scrutiny of a man who sat at the table next to him. He was a man of middle age, with a powerful, forceful face. He had a small, dark beard and very piercing grey eyes, and an ease and assurance of manner which placed him among the higher ranks of the professional classes. His name, Jack knew, was Lavington, and he had heard vague rumours as to his being a well-known medical specialist. But, as Jack was not a frequenter of Harley Street, the name had conveyed little or nothing to him. But this morning he was very conscious of the quiet observation under which he was being kept, and it frightened him a little. Was his secret written plainly in his face for all to see? Did this man, by reason of his professional calling, know that there was something amiss in the hidden grey matter? Jack shivered at the thought. Was it true? Was he really going mad? Was the whole thing a hallucination? Or was it a gigantic hoax? And suddenly, a very simple way of testing the solution occurred to him. He had hitherto been alone on his round. Supposing someone else was with him, then one out of three things might happen. The voice might be silent, they might both hear it, or he only might hear it. That evening he proceeded to carry his plan into effect. Lavington was the man he wanted with him. They fell into conversation easily enough. The older man might have been waiting for such an opening. It was clear that for some reason or other Jack interested him. The latter was able to come quite easily and naturally to the suggestion that they might play a few holes together before breakfast. The arrangement was made for the following morning. They started out a little before 7. It was a perfect day, still and cloudless, but not too warm. The doctor was playing well, Jack wretchedly. His whole mind was intent on the forthcoming crisis. He kept glancing surreptitiously at his watch. They reached the 7th tee, between which and the hole the cottage was situated. About 7:20. The girl, as usual, was in the garden as they passed. She did not look up. 2 balls lay on the green, Jack's near the hole, the doctor's some little distance away. "I've got this for it," said Lavington. "I must go for it, I suppose." He bent down, judging the line he should take. Jack stood rigid, his eyes glued to his watch. It was exactly 25 minutes past 7. The ball ran swiftly along the grass, stopped on the edge of the hole, hesitated, and dropped in. "Good putt," said Jack. His voice sounded hoarse and unlike himself. He shoved his wristwatch farther up his arm with a sigh of overwhelming relief. Nothing had happened. The spell was broken. "If you don't mind waiting a minute," he said, "I think I'll have a pipe." They paused a while on the 8th tee. Jack filled and lit the pipe with fingers that trembled a little in spite of himself. An enormous weight seemed to have lifted from his mind. "Lord, what a good day it is," he remarked, staring at the prospect ahead of him with great contentment. "Go on, Lavington, your swipe." And then it came. Just at the very instant the doctor was hitting. A woman's voice, high and agonized. "Murder! Help! Murder!" The pipe fell from Jack's nerveless hand as he spun round in the direction of the sound, and then, remembering, gazed breathlessly at his companion. Lavington was looking down the course, shading his eyes. "A bit short. Just cleared the bunker, though, I think." He had heard nothing. The world seemed to spin round with Jack. He took a step or two, lurching heavily. When he recovered himself, he was lying on the short turf, and Lavington was bending over him. "Take it easy now, take it easy." "What did I do?" "You fainted, young man. You gave a very good try at it." "My God," said Jack, and groaned. "What's the trouble? Something on your mind?" "I'll tell you in 1 minute, but I'd like to ask you something first." The doctor lit his own pipe and settled himself on the bank. "Ask anything you like," he said comfortably. "You've been watching me for the last day or two? Why?" Lavington's eyes twinkled a little. "That's rather an awkward question. A cat can look at a king, you know." "Don't put me off. I'm earnest. Why was it? I've a vital reason for asking." Lavington's face grew serious. "I'll answer you quite honestly. I recognized in you all the signs of a man laboring under a sense of acute strain, and it intrigued me what that strain could be." "I can tell you that easily enough," said Jack bitterly. "I'm going mad." He stopped, dramatically, but his statement not seeming to arouse the interest and consternation he expected, he repeated it. "I tell you I'm going mad." "Very curious," murmured Lavington. "Very curious indeed." Jack felt indignant. "I suppose that's all it does seem to you. Doctors are so damned callous." Come, my young friend, you're talking at random. To begin with, although I've taken my degree, I do not practice medicine. Strictly speaking, I'm not a doctor. Not a doctor of the body, that is. Jack looked at him keenly. "Or the mind?" "Yes, in a sense. But more truly, I call myself a doctor of the soul." "Oh." "I perceive the disparagement in your tone, and yet we must use some word to denote the active principle which can be separated and exist independently of its fleshy home, the body. You've got to come to terms with the soul, you know, young man. It isn't just a religious term invented by clergymen. But we'll call it the mind or the subconscious self or any term that suits you better. You took offence at my tone just now, but I can assure you that it really did strike me as very curious that such a well-balanced and perfectly normal young man as yourself should suffer from the delusion that he was going out of his mind." "I'm out of my mind, all right. Absolutely balmy." "Oh, forgive me for saying so, but I don't believe it." "I suffer from delusions." "After dinner?" "No, in the morning." "Can't be done," said the doctor, relighting his pipe, which had gone out. "I tell you, I hear things that no one else hears." "One man in 1,000 can see the moons of Jupiter. Because the other 999 can't see them, there's no reason to doubt that the moons of Jupiter exist, and certainly no reason for calling the 1,000th man a lunatic." "The moons of Jupiter are a proved scientific fact." "Well, it's quite possible that the delusions of today may be the proved scientific facts of tomorrow." In spite of himself, Lavington's matter-of-fact manner was having its effect upon Jack. He felt immeasurably soothed and cheered. The doctor looked at him attentively for a minute or two and then nodded. "That's better," he said. "The trouble with you young fellows is that you're so cocksure nothing can exist outside your own philosophy that you get the wind up when something occurs to jolt you out of that opinion. Let's hear your grounds for believing that you're going mad, and we'll decide whether or not to lock you up afterwards." As faithfully as he could, Jack narrated the whole series of occurrences. "But what I can't understand," he ended, "is why this morning it should come at 7:30, 5 minutes late." Lavington thought for a minute or two, then, "What's the time by your watch now?" he asked. 8:15, replied Jack, consulting it. "That's simple enough, then. Mine says 8:20. Your watch is 5 minutes fast. That's a very interesting and important point to me. In fact, it's invaluable." "In what way?" Jack was beginning to get interested. "Well, the obvious explanation is that on the first morning you did hear some such cry. May have been a joke, may not. On the following mornings you suggested to yourself to hear it at exactly the same time." "I'm sure I didn't." "Well, not consciously, of course, but the subconscious plays us some funny tricks, you know. But anyway, that explanation won't wash. If it was a case of suggestion, you would have heard the cry at 25 minutes past 7 by your watch, and you could never have heard it when the time, as you thought, was past." "Well, then?" "Well, it's obvious, isn't it? This cry for help occupies a perfectly definite place and time in space. Place is the vicinity of that cottage, and the time is 25 minutes past 7.
"Yes, but why should I be the one to hear it? I don't believe in ghosts and all that spook stuff, spirits rapping and all the rest of it. Why should I hear the damn thing?"
That we can't tell at present. It's a curious thing that many of the best mediums are made out of confirmed skeptics. It isn't the people who are interested in occult phenomena who get the manifestations. Some people see and hear things that other people don't. We don't know why, and 9 times out of 10 they don't want to see or hear them. And they're convinced that they're suffering from delusions, just as you were. It's like electricity. Some substances are good conductors, others are non-conductors, and for a long time we didn't know why, and had to be content just to accept the fact. Nowadays, we do know why. Someday, no doubt, we shall know why you hear this thing, and I and the girl don't. Everything is governed by natural law, you know. There's no such thing, really, as the supernatural. Finding out the laws that govern the so-called psychic phenomena is going to be a tough job, but every little helps."
"But what am I going to do?" asked Jack.
Lavington chuckled. "Well, practical, I see. Well, my young friend, you're going to have a good breakfast and get off to the city without worrying your head further about things you don't understand. I, on the other hand, am going to poke about and see what I can find out about that cottage back there. That's where the mystery centres, I dare swear."
Jack rose to his feet. "Right, sir, I'm on, but I say—"
"Yes?"
Jack flushed awkwardly. "I'm sure the girl's all right," he muttered.
Lavington looked amused. "You didn't tell me she was a pretty girl. Well, cheer up. I think the mystery started before her time."
End of side 2. End of side 2. End of side 2. End of side 2. Side 3.
Jack arrived home that evening in a perfect fever of curiosity. He was by now pinning his faith blindly to Lavington. The doctor had accepted the matter so naturally, had been so matter-of-fact and unperturbed by it, that Jack was impressed. He found his new friend waiting for him in the hall when he came down for dinner, and the doctor suggested that they should dine together at the same table.
"Any news, sir?"
asked Jack anxiously. "Why, I've collected the life history of Heather Cottage, all right. It was tenanted first by an old gardener and his wife. The old man died, and the old woman went to her daughter. Then a builder got hold of it and modernized it with great success, selling it to a city gentleman who used it for weekends. About a year ago, he sold it to some people called Turner, Mr. and Mrs. Turner. They seem to have been a rather curious couple from all I can make out. He was an Englishman, his wife was popularly supposed to be partly Russian, and was a very handsome, exotic-looking woman. They lived very quietly, seeing no one, and hardly ever going outside the cottage garden. The local rumour goes that they were afraid of something, but I don't think we ought to rely on that." And then suddenly one day they departed and cleared out one morning early and never came back. The agent here got a letter from Mr. Turner, written from London, instructing him to sell up the place as quickly as possible. The furniture was sold off, and the house itself was sold to a Mr. Moore-labourer. He only actually lived in it a fortnight, then he advertised it to be let, furnished. The people who have it now are a consumptive French professor and his daughter. They've been there just 10 days.
Jack digested this in silence. "I don't see that gets us any further," he said at last. "Do you?"
"I rather want to know more about the Turners," said Lavington quietly. "They left very early in the morning, you remember. As far as I can make out, nobody actually saw them go. Mr. Turner has been seen since, but I can't find anybody who has seen Mrs. Turner."
Jack hailed. "It can't be. You don't mean—"
"Don't excite yourself, young man. The influence of anyone at the point of death, and especially a violent death, upon their surroundings is very strong. Those surroundings might conceivably absorb that influence, transmitting it in turn to a suitably tuned receiver, in this case, yourself."
"Why me?" murmured Jack rebelliously. "Why not someone who could do some good?"
You're regarding the force as intelligent and purposeful instead of blind and mechanical. I do not believe myself in earth-bound spirits haunting a spot for one particular purpose, but the thing I have seen again and again, until I can hardly believe it to be pure coincidence, is a kind of blind groping towards justice, a subterranean moving of blind forces, always working obscurely towards that end.
He shook himself as though casting off some obsession that preoccupied him, and turned to Jack with a ready smile.
"Let us banish the subject for tonight, at all events," he suggested.
Jack agreed readily enough, but didn't find it so easy to banish the subject from his own mind. During the weekend he made vigorous inquiries of his own, but succeeded in eliciting little more than the doctor had done. He had definitely given up playing golf before breakfast. The next link in the chain came from an unexpected quarter. On getting back one day, Jack was informed that a young lady was waiting to see him. To his intense surprise, it proved to be the girl of the garden, a pansy girl, as he always called her in his own mind. She was very nervous and confused. "You will forgive me, monsieur, for coming to seek you like this, but there is something I want to tell you. She looked around uncertainly. "Oh, come in here," said Jack promptly, leading the way into the now deserted ladies' drawing-room of the hotel, a dreary apartment with a good deal of red plush about it. "Now sit down, Miss Marchot, monsieur. Felice Marchot. Sit down, Mademoiselle Marchot, and tell me all about it." Felice sat down obediently. She was dressed in dark green today, and the beauty and the charm of the proud little face was more evident than ever. Jack's heart beat faster as he sat down beside her. "It's like this," explained Felice. "We have been here but a short time, and from the beginning we hear the house, our so sweet little house, is haunted. No servant will stay in it. That does not matter so much. Me, I can do the ménage and cook easily enough." "Angel," thought the infatuated young man. "She's wonderful." But he maintained an outward semblance of business-like attention. "This talk of ghosts, I think it is all folly, that is, until 4 days ago. Monsieur, 4 nights running, I have had the same dream. A lady stands there. She's beautiful, tall, and very fair. In her hands she holds a blue china jar. She is distressed, very distressed, and continually she holds out the jar to me, as though imploring me to do something with it. But alas, she cannot speak, and I do not know what she asks. That was a dream for the first 2 nights, but the night before last there was more of it. She and the blue jar faded away, and suddenly I heard her voice crying out. I know it is her voice, you comprehend. And oh, monsieur, the words she says are those you spoke to me that morning. Murder! Help! Murder! I woke in terror. I say to myself, it is a nightmare. The words you heard are an accident. But last night the dream came again. Monsieur, what is it? You too have heard. What shall we do?
Lise's face was terrified. Her small hands clasped themselves together, and she gazed appealingly at Jack. The latter affected an unconcern he did not feel. "Oh, that's all right, Mademoiselle Marchot. You mustn't worry. I tell you what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind. Repeat the whole story to a friend of mine who is staying here, a Dr. Lavington." Elise signified her willingness to adopt this course, and Jack went off in search of Lavington. He returned with him a few minutes later. Lavington gave the girl a keen scrutiny as he acknowledged Jack's hurried introductions. With a few reassuring words, he soon put the girl at her ease, and he, in his turn, listened attentively to her story. "Very curious," he said when she'd finished. "You tell your father of this?" Elise shook her head.
"I have not liked to worry him. He is very ill still."
Her eyes filled with tears.
"I keep from him anything that might excite or agitate him."
"I understand," said Lavington kindly. "I'm glad you came to us, Mademoiselle Marchot. Hartington here, as you know, had experienced something similar to yours. I think I may say that we are well on the track now. There's nothing else that you can think of?"
Elise gave a quick movement. "Of course! How stupid I am! It is the point of the whole story. Look, monsieur, at what I found at the back of one of the cupboards, where it had slipped behind the shelf."
She held out to them a dirty piece of drawing paper on which was executed roughly, in watercolours, a sketch of a woman. It was a mere daub, but the likeness was probably good enough. It represented a tall, fair woman with something subtly un-English about her face. She was standing by a table on which was standing a blue china jar.
"I only found it this morning," explained Felice. "Monsieur le Docteur, that is the face of the woman I saw in my dream, and that is the identical blue jar."
"Extraordinary," commented Lavington. "The key to the mystery is evidently the blue jar. Looks like a Chinese jar to me, probably an old one. Seems to have a curious raised pattern over it."
"It is Chinese," declared Jack. "I've seen an exactly similar one in my uncle's collection. He's a great collector of Chinese porcelain, you know, and I remember noticing a jar just like that a short time ago."
"The Chinese jar," mused Lavington. He remained a minute or two lost in thought, and then raised his head suddenly, a curious light shining in his eyes. "Hartington, how long has your uncle had that jar?"
"How long? I really don't know."
"Think. Did he buy it lately?"
"I don't know. Oh, yes, I believe he did, now I come to think of it. I'm not very interested in porcelain myself, but I remember his showing me his recent acquisitions, and this was one of them."
"Less than 2 months ago? The Turners left Heather Cottage just 2 months ago."
"Oh, yes, I believe it was."
"Your uncle attends country sales sometimes?"
"Oh, he's always tooling around to sales."
"Then there's no inherent improbability in our assuming that he bought this particular piece of porcelain at the sale of the Turners' things. A curious coincidence. Or perhaps what I call the groping of blind justice. Hartington, you must find out from your uncle at once where he bought this jar."
Jack's face fell. "I'm afraid that's impossible. Uncle George is away on the continent. I don't even know where to write to him."
"How long will he be away?"
3 weeks to a month at least."
There was a silence. Felice sat looking anxiously from one man to the other.
"Is there nothing that we can do?"
she asked timidly.
"Oh, yes, there is one thing,"
said Lavington in a tone of suppressed excitement.
"It's unusual, perhaps, but I believe that it will succeed. Hartington, you must get hold of that jar. Bring it down here, and if Mademoiselle permits, we will spend a night at Heather Cottage taking the blue jar with us."
Jack felt his skin creep uncomfortably.
"What do you think will happen?"
he asked uneasily.
"I haven't the slightest idea, but I honestly believe that the mystery will be solved and the ghost laid. Quite possibly there may be a false bottom to the jar, and something is concealed inside it. If no phenomenon occurs, we must use our own ingenuity."
Elise clasped her hands.
"It is a wonderful idea,"
she exclaimed. Her eyes were alight with enthusiasm. Jack did not feel nearly so enthusiastic. In fact, he was inwardly funking it badly, but nothing would have induced him to admit the fact before Felice. The doctor acted as though his suggestion were the most natural one in the world.
"When can you get the jar?"
asked Felice, turning to Jack.
"Tomorrow,"
said the latter unwillingly. He had to go through with it now, but the memory of the frenzied cry for help that had haunted him each morning was something to be ruthlessly thrust down and not thought about more than could be helped. He went to his uncle's house the following evening and took away the jar in question. He was more than ever convinced when he saw it again that it was the identical one pictured in the watercolour sketch, but carefully as he looked it over he could see no sign that it contained a secret receptacle of any kind. It was 11 o'clock when he and Lavington arrived at Heather Cottage. Felice was on the lookout for them and opened the door softly before they had time to knock.
"Come in," she whispered. "My father is asleep upstairs, and we must not wake him. I have made coffee for you in here."
She led the way into a small, cosy sitting room. A spirit lamp stood in the grate, and bending over it she brewed them both some fragrant coffee. Then Jack unfastened the Chinese jar from its many wrappings. Felice gasped as her eyes fell on it.
"Ah, but yes, she cried eagerly. "That is it! I would know it anywhere!"
Meanwhile, Lavington was making his own preparations. He removed all the ornaments from a small table and set it in the middle of the room. Round it he placed 3 chairs. Then, taking the blue jar from Jack, he placed it in the centre of the table. "Now," he said, "we're ready. Turn off the lights and let us sit round the table in the darkness." The others obeyed him. Lavington's voice spoke again out of the darkness. "Think of nothing, or of everything. Do not force the mind. It is possible that one of us has mediumistic powers. If so, that person will go into a trance. Remember, there is nothing to fear. Cast out fear from your hearts and drift. His voice died away, and there was silence. Minute by minute the silence seemed to grow more pregnant with possibilities. It was all very well for Lavington to say, "Cast out fear." It was not fear that Jack felt, it was panic, and he was almost certain that Felice felt the same way. Suddenly he heard her voice, low and terrified. "Something terrible is going to happen. I feel it." "Cast out fear," said Lavington. "Do not fight against the influence." The darkness seemed to get darker, and the silence more acute, and nearer came that indefinable sense of menace. Jack felt himself choking, stifling. The evil thing was very near. And then the moment of conflict passed. He was drifting downstream, his lids closed. Peace, darkness. Jack stirred slightly. His head was heavy as lead. Where was he? Sunshine. Birds. He lay staring up at the sky. Then it all came back to him. The sitting, the little room, Felice, and the doctor. What had happened? He sat up, his head throbbing unpleasantly, and looked round him. He was lying in a little copse not far from the cottage. No one else was near him. He took out his watch. To his amazement, it registered 12:30. Jack struggled to his feet and ran as fast as he could in the direction of the cottage. They must have been alarmed by his failure to come out of the trance and carried him out into the open air. Arrived at the cottage, he knocked loudly on the door, but there was no answer, and no signs of life about it. Well, they must have gone off to get help, or else... Jack felt an indefinable fear invade him. What had happened last night? He made his way back to the hotel as quickly as possible. He was about to make some inquiries at the office when he was diverted by a colossal punch in the ribs, which nearly knocked him off his feet. Turning in some indignation, he beheld a white-haired old gentleman wheezing with mirth.
"Didn't expect me, my boy! Didn't expect me, eh?"
said this individual. "Why, Uncle George, I thought you were miles away in Italy somewhere."
"Ah, but I wasn't. Landed at Dover last night. Thought I'd motor up to town and stop to see you on the way. And what did I find? Out all night, huh? Nice goings-on, hmm?"
"Uncle George," Jack checked him firmly, "I've got the most extraordinary story to tell you. I dare say you won't believe it."
"I dare say I shan't," laughed the old man. "You do your best, my boy."
"But I must have something to eat," continued Jack. "I'm famished." He led the way to the dining room, and over a substantial repast he narrated the whole story. "And God knows what's become of them," he ended. His uncle seemed on the verge of apoplexy.
"The jar!"
he managed to ejaculate at last.
"The blue jar! What's become of that?"
Jack stared at him in non-comprehension, but submerged in the torrent of words that followed, he began to understand. It came with a rush.
"Ming! Unique gem of my collection, worth £10,000 at least. Offer from Hoggenheimer, the American millionaire, only one of its kind in the world. Confound it, sir, what have you done with my blue jar?"
Jack rushed from the room. He must find Lavington. The young lady at the office eyed him coldly. "Dr. Lavington left late last night by motor. He left a note for you." Jack tore it open. It was short and to the point.
"My dear young friend, is the day of the supernatural over? Not quite, especially when tricked out in new scientific language. Kindest regards from Felice, invalid father, and myself. We have 12 hours start, which ought to be ample. Yours ever, Ambrose Lavington, Doctor of the Soul."
The red signal. "No, but how too thrilling," said pretty Mrs. Eversley, opening her lovely but slightly vacant eyes very wide. "They always say women have a sixth sense. Do you think it's true, Sir Allington?" The famous alienist smiled sardonically. He had an unbounded contempt for the foolish pretty type, such as his fellow guest. Allington West was the supreme authority on mental disease, and he was fully alive to his own position and importance, a slightly pompous man of full figure. "A great deal of nonsense is talked. I know that, Mrs. Eversley. What does the term mean? A sixth sense? Oh, you scientific men are always so severe. And it really is extraordinary the way one seems to positively know things sometimes. Just know them, feel them. I mean, quite uncanny, it really is. Claire knows what I mean, don't you, Claire?" She appealed to her hostess with a slight pout and a tilted shoulder. Claire Trent did not reply at once. It was a small dinner party. She and her husband, Violet Eversley, Sir Allington West, and his nephew Dermot West, who was an old friend of Jack Trent's. Jack Trent himself, a somewhat heavy, florid man with a good-humoured smile and a pleasant, lazy laugh, took up the thread. "Bunkum, Violet. Your best friend is killed in a railway accident. Straight away you remember that you dreamt of a black cat last Tuesday. Marvellous. You felt all along that something was going to happen." "Oh, no, Jack. You're mixing up premonitions with intuition now. Come now, Sir Allington, you must admit that premonitions are real." "To a certain extent, perhaps," admitted the physician cautiously. "But coincidence accounts for a good deal, and then there is the invariable tendency to make the most of a story afterwards. You've always got to take that into account." "I don't think there's any such thing as premonition," said Claire Trent rather abruptly, "or intuition, or a sixth sense, or any of the things we talk about so glibly. We go through life like a train rushing through the darkness to an unknown destination." "That's hardly a good simile, Mrs. Trent," said Dermot West, lifting his head for the first time and taking part in the discussion. There was a curious glitter in the clear grey eyes that shone out rather oddly from the deeply tanned face. "You've forgotten the signals, you see."
Signals?
"Yes, green, if it's all right, and red for danger."
Red for danger? How thrilling!"
breathed Violet Eversley. Dermot turned from her rather impatiently. "That's just a way of describing it, of course. Danger ahead, the red signal, look out." Trent stared at him curiously. "You speak as though it were an actual experience, Dermot, old boy." "So it is. Has been, I mean." "Give us the yarn." "I can give you one instance. Out in Mesopotamia, just after the armistice, I came into my tent one evening with a feeling strong upon me. Danger. Look out. Hadn't the ghost of a notion what it was all about. I made a round of the camp, fussed unnecessarily, took all precautions against an attack by hostile Arabs, and then I went back to my tent. As soon as I got inside, the feeling popped up again stronger than ever. Danger. In the end, I took a blanket outside, rolled myself up in it, and slept there. Well, the next morning, when I went inside the tent, first thing I saw was a great knife arrangement about half a yard long, struck down through my bunk, just where I would have lain. I soon found out about it. One of the Arab servants, his son, had been shot as a spy. What have you got to say to that, Uncle Allington, as an example of what I call the red signal? The specialist smiled non-committally. "A very interesting story, my dear Dermot. But not one that you would accept unreservedly." "Oh, yes, I have no doubt that you had the premonition of danger, just as you state. But it is the origin of the premonition I dispute. According to you, it came from without, impressed by some outside source upon your mentality. But nowadays we find that nearly everything comes from within, from our subconscious self." "Good old subconscious," cried Jack Trent. "It's the jack of all trades nowadays." Sir Allington continued without heeding the interruption. "I suggest that by some glance or look this Arab had betrayed himself. Your conscious self didn't notice or remember, but with your subconscious self it was otherwise. The subconscious never forgets. We believe, too, that it can reason and deduce quite independently of the higher or conscious will. Your subconscious self, then, believed that an attempt might be made to assassinate you, and succeeded in forcing its fear upon your conscious realization." "Well, that sounds very convincing, I admit," said Dermot, smiling. "Oh, but not nearly so exciting," pouted Mrs. Eversley. "It's also possible that you may have been subconsciously aware of the hate felt by the man towards you. What in the old days used to be called telepathy certainly exists, though the conditions governing it are very little understood." "Have there been any other instances?" asked Claire of Dermot. "Oh, yes, but nothing very pictorial, and I suppose they could all be explained under the heading of coincidence. I refused an invitation to a country house once for no other reason than the hoisting of the red signal. The place was burnt out during the week. By the way, Uncle Allington, where does the subconscious come in there?" "I'm afraid it doesn't," said Allington, smiling. "But you've got an equally good explanation. Come now, no need to be tactful with near relatives." "Well then, nephew, I venture to suggest that you refused the invitation for the ordinary reason that you didn't much want to go, and that after the fire you suggested to yourself that you had had a warning of danger, which explanation you now believe implicitly." "It's hopeless," laughed Dermot. "It's heads, you win; tails, I lose." "Never mind, Mr. West," cried Violet Eversley. "I believe in your red signal implicitly. Is the time in Mesopotamia the last time you had it?" "Yes, until—" "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing." Dermot sat silent. The words which had nearly left his lips were, "Yes, until tonight." They'd come quite unbidden to his lips, voicing a thought which had as yet not been consciously realized, but he was aware at once that they were true. The red signal was looming up out of the darkness. Danger. Danger at hand. But why? What conceivable danger could there be here? here, in the house of his friends. At least, well, yes, there was that kind of danger. He looked at Claire Trent, her whiteness, her slenderness, the exquisite droop of her golden head. But that danger had been there for some time. It was never likely to get acute. For Jack Trent was his best friend, and more than his best friend, a man who had saved his life in Flanders and had been recommended for the V.C. for doing so. A good fellow, Jack, one of the best. Damn bad luck that he should have fallen in love with Jack's wife. He'd get over it some day, he supposed. A thing couldn't go on hurting like this forever. One could starve it out. That was it. Starve it out. It was not as though she would ever guess, and if she did guess, there was no danger of her caring. Statue, a beautiful statue, a thing of gold and ivory and pale pink coral, a toy for a king, not a real woman. Claire, the very thought of her name, uttered silently, hurt him. He must get over it. He'd cared for women before. But not like this, said something. Not like this. Well, there it was. No danger there. Heartache, yes, but not danger. Not the danger of the red signal. That was for something else. He looked round the table, and it struck him for the first time that it was rather an unusual little gathering. His uncle, for instance, seldom dined out in this small, informal way. It was not as though the Trents were old friends. Until this evening, Dermot had not been aware that he knew them at all. To be sure, there was an excuse. A rather notorious medium was coming after dinner to give a séance. Sir Addington professed to be mildly interested in spiritualism. Yes, that was an excuse, certainly. The word forced itself on his notice. An excuse. Was the séance just an excuse to make the specialist's presence at dinner natural? If so, what was the real object of his being here? A host of details came rushing into Dermot's mind, trifles unnoticed at the time, or, as his uncle would have said, unnoticed by the conscious mind. The great physician had looked oddly, very oddly, at Claire more than once. He seemed to be watching her. She was uneasy under his scrutiny. She made little twitching motions with her hands. She was nervous, horribly nervous. And could it be frightened? Why was she frightened? With a jerk, he came back to the conversation round the table. Mrs. Eversley had got the great man talking upon his own subject. "My dear lady," he was saying, "what is madness? I can assure you that the more we study the subject, the more difficult we find it to pronounce. We all practice a certain amount of self-deception, and when we carry it so far as to believe we are the Tsar of Russia, we are shut up or restrained. But there is a long road before we reach that point. At what particular spot on it shall we erect a post and say, on this side sanity, on the other madness? It can't be done, you know. And I will tell you this. If the man suffering from a delusion happened to hold his tongue about it, in all probability we should never be able to distinguish him from a normal individual. The extraordinary sanity of the insane is a most interesting subject." Sir Allington sipped his wine with appreciation and beamed upon the company. "I've always heard they're very cunning," remarked Mrs. Eversley. "Loonies, I mean." "Remarkably so. And suppression of one's particular delusion has a disastrous effect very often. All suppressions are dangerous, as psychoanalysis has taught us. The man who has a harmless eccentricity and can indulge it as such seldom goes over the borderline, but the man, or woman, who is to all appearance perfectly normal, may be in reality a poignant source of danger to the community." His gaze travelled gently down the table to Claire and then back again. He sipped his wine once more. A horrible fear shook Dermot. Was that what he meant? Was that what he was driving at? Why, it's impossible, but... "And all from suppressing oneself," sighed Mrs. Eversley. "I quite see that one should be very careful always to express one's personality. The dangers of the other are frightful." "My dear Mrs. Eversley," expostulated the physician, You've quite misunderstood me. The cause of the mischief is in the physical matter of the brain, sometimes arising from some outward agency, such as a blow, sometimes, alas, congenital.
Heredity is so sad, sighed the lady vaguely. Consumption and all that.
Tuberculosis is not hereditary, said Sir Ellington dryly.
Oh, isn't it? I always thought it was. But madness is. How dreadful. What else?
Gout, said Sir Ellington, smiling. And colour blindness. The latter is rather interesting. It is transmitted direct to males, but is latent in females. So while there are many colour-blind men, for a woman to be colour-blind, it must have been latent in her mother as well as present in her father. Rather an unusual state of things to occur. That is what is called sex-limited heredity.
Oh, interesting. But madness is not like that, is it?
Madness can be handed down to men or women equally, said the physician gravely. Claire rose suddenly, pushing back her chair so abruptly that it overturned and fell to the ground. She was very pale, and the nervous motions of her fingers were very apparent. You will not be long, will you? She begged. Mrs. Thompson will be here in a few minutes now. One glass of port, and I will be with you for one, declared Sir Ellington. To see this wonderful Mrs. Thompson's performance is what I've come for, isn't it? Yes, not that I needed any inducement. He bowed. Claire gave a faint smile of acknowledgment and passed out of the room, her hand on Mrs. Eversley's shoulder. "Afraid I've been talking shop," remarked the physician as he resumed his seat. "Forgive me, my dear fellow." "Not at all," said Trent, perfunctorily. He looked strained and worried. For the first time, Dermot felt an outsider in the company of his friend. Between these two was a secret that even an old friend might not share, and yet the whole thing was fantastic and incredible. What had he to go upon? Nothing but a couple of glances and a woman's nervousness. They lingered over their wine but a very short time, and arrived up in the drawing-room just as Mrs. Thompson was announced. The medium was a plump, middle-aged woman, atrociously dressed in magenta velvet, with a loud, rather common voice. "I hope I'm not late, Mrs. Trent," she said cheerily. "You did say 9 o'clock, didn't you?" "You're quite punctual, Mrs. Thompson," said Claire in her sweet, slight, husky voice. "This is our little circle." No further introductions were made, as was evidently the custom. The medium swept them all with a shrewd, penetrating eye. "I hope we shall get some good results," she remarked briskly. "I can't tell you how I hate it when I go out and I can't give satisfaction, so to speak. It just makes me mad. But I think Shiromako, my Japanese control, will be able to get through all right tonight. I'm feeling ever so fit, and I refuse the Welsh rabbit, fond of toasted cheese though I am." Dermot listened, half amused, half disgusted. How prosaic the whole thing was. And yet, was he not judging foolishly? Everything, after all, was natural. The powers claimed by mediums were natural powers, as yet imperfectly understood. A great surgeon might be wary of indigestion on the eve of a delicate operation. Why not Mrs. Thompson? Chairs were arranged in a circle, lights so that they could conveniently be raised or lowered. Dermot noticed that there was no question of tests, or of Sir Ellington satisfying himself as to the conditions of the séance. Oh, this business of Mrs. Thompson was only a blind. Sir Ellington was here for quite another purpose. Claire's mother, Dermot remembered, had died abroad. There had been some mystery about her. Hereditary. With a jerk, he forced his mind back to the surroundings of the moment. Everyone took their places, and the lights were turned out, all but a small red-shaded one on a far table. For a while, nothing was heard but the low, even breathing of the medium. Gradually it grew more and more stertorous. Then, with a suddenness that made Dermot jump, a loud rap came from the far end of the room. It was repeated from the other side. Then a perfect crescendo of raps was heard. They died away, and a sudden, high peal of mocking laughter rang through the room. Then silence, broken by a voice utterly unlike that of Mrs. Thompson. A high-pitched, quaintly inflected voice.
"I am here, gentlemen,"
it said.
"Yes, I am here. You wish to ask me things?"
Who are you? Shiramako?
"Yes. I, Shiramako. I passed over a long time ago. I work. I'm very happy.